All right, good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our study once again. We're continuing in the Gospel of John. Today, my plan is to study the entire chapter of chapter 9. It's about the healing of a blind man. And I would just like to remind you that Jesus was a healer of the blind. It might even been the hallmark of his ministry because blindness was considered a metaphor for darkness, which would be spiritual blindness or spiritual darkness, for which Jesus was the remedy, being light. Okay, there have been several instances through the various Gospels of Jesus healing the blind. There was one that was particularly interesting to me. It was about blind Bartimaeus. It's found in Mark 10, verses 46 to 52. And in that set of scriptures, depending on your translation, you see that he was called a blind beggar in some of the instances. Some others, like the NIV, calls him a blind man who was begging, which I think is kind of interesting just to think about for a minute, because he was a man first. He was also blind, and he begged, not just for anything. He was pretty much helpless. If you've ever known anybody that's blind, you know what a horrible disability that is, because it requires a dependence on someone else to be able to do things. This man was begging, and what was interesting was when Jesus passed by, it says that he shouted. He was shouting, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And then as he got closer, he passed by and he shouted even louder, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus called him over, and he jumped up and came over to Jesus. And what is interesting is that Jesus said in Mark 10, verse 51, Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do? What do you want me to do?" Now that's interesting to me, because Jesus saw him as a man first, and then he saw him as a blind man. And the guy is not shouting to be healed. He was shouting for the Son of David, for Jesus to have mercy on him. And in Jesus asking him, he is getting clarification as to what the expectations are of this man. Jesus told him he said, "Rabbi," he said, "I want to see," in answer to Jesus' question. And Jesus said, "Go, your faith has healed you." And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. So he didn't run off and, telling everybody about what had happened. He just stayed with Jesus and followed him. There was another instance of two that were healed, two blind men healed in Galilee in Matthew 9. Let's just take a peek at it. Matthew 9. These two guys, it's Matthew 9, verses 27 to 31. These two guys, two blind men, were following Jesus, and he says, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." And Jesus said in Matthew 9, verse 28, he said, when Jesus had gone indoors, the blind men came to him and asked him, and Jesus asked him, "What do you believe? Do you believe that I am able to do this, meaning heal you? And of course they said yes. Then he touched their eyes. They said, yes, Lord. They called him Lord. And according to your faith, it has been done to you. So he's been healed. And Jesus said, see that no one knows about this. These guys, different than blind Bartimaeus, who got no instruction at all what he's to do after he's healed, they were told, don't tell anybody. And what did they do? Rather than being faithful to Jesus in not telling anybody, it says that they went around spreading the news about him all over the region. Okay, then there was another situation where there was a man who was not only blind, but he was mute. In Matthew 12, verses 22 to 23, there was a blind man in Bethsaida, which was Mark 8, verses 22 to 26. And then there was a general statement in Matthew 21, verse 14, that the blind and the lame came to the temple to be healed. So Jesus dealing with blindness was nothing unusual. It happened quite often throughout his ministry. So my question to you is, what causes blindness, physical blindness? One kind of blindness is glaucoma. They don't really know what causes it, but they think the cause might be pressure on the optic nerve, or it could be high pressure in the eye just in general. And our great doctors, and I mean that sincerely, with our advanced medicines, can arrest the blindness so that it doesn't necessarily get worse, but they can't cure it. Glaucoma is uncurable. Then there's another kind, macular degeneration, which at the same time can also be arrested if you're willing to shell out $10,000 for a shot in the eye every so often. So it's not a one shot does all. It's a periodic shot, 10,000 a piece. Then there's so there neither one of these two, and probably depending on what kind of blindness you have, many of them are not curable. The people of Jesus' day had these two. I'm sure glaucoma and macular degeneration were present at his time also, though they're not called that. But they were caused by, much of the blindness of his day was caused by unsanitary conditions, mainly in the water. Plus, they even believed that sin in the light. Now, this is interesting because we've heard it before, and we're going to hear it as we get further into this event in Jesus' life of him healing the man born blind, which we're going to see in a few minutes. But they thought that the believer, if he had any serious illness, that it was caused by sin in his life, or sin in his parents' life, or sin in someone's life that was closely related to him. That was just the belief of the day. So let's read this account of our study today in chapter 9 and see what we're dealing with. It's about a man who was blind, who was born blind. He was blind from birth. All right, so let's get into chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. Listen as I read. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? These were his disciples asking him. So it's not like it was a pagan belief. It's not that like it was a pagan belief. The guys closest to Jesus were asking the same kind of question. Jesus sees a man blind from birth. It's interesting. He sees the blind man. Somehow he knows that he's blind. We don't know how he knows. He just seemed to know, as he seemed to know many times in the Gospels, talking about his life. But he knew that he was blind, and he knew how long he had been blind. In verse 2, he's called Rabbi by his disciples. Rabbi who sinned, so on and so forth. So Rabbi means teacher, but more specifically, it means in this situation, their teacher. They've had the rabbis, they've had other rabbis, but some who teach on the spiritual, none teach on the same spiritual level as Jesus. Another interesting note from Charles Stanley. Charles has gone on to be with the Lord now, but I listened to him for many years. I still do. He indicated to us that he was called Lord. Jesus was called Lord 185 times in the four Gospels. They didn't call him Jesus. And let's just watch as we go through the Gospel of John and see if we ever see him called Jesus by his disciples. But we'll notice what they do call him. So I don't know that I'll bring it up every time, but you just take some mental notes as we go. So Rabbi is what he's called here. So here we go. The disciples wanted to know the cause of the sin. The choices are the man, the sin of the man, or the sin of his parents. Which one of those two situations caused his blindness? The disciples were looking for human causes, which would be, in either one of those cases, it would be considered a punishment by God. Remember back on John 5, verses 1 through 15, there was a crippled man who had been crippled for 38 years, but the indication in his case was his crippling disease may have been caused by his sin, but it was more of a consequence of his sin, not the punishment. His disease could be caused by his sin as a consequence, but not caused because he sinned. Okay, do you see what I'm saying? You can be punished for something because you did something, or you can have some kind of disease or illness or injury that comes about as a result of what you did, not because somebody did something to you because of something you did. For example, of course, God could punish. He would call it discipline for a believer, but nevertheless, you could also say you were driving under the influence of alcohol. It's probably considered a sin. Well, there's a great likelihood that because of the condition in which you're driving, you can have a wreck and have some kind of injury to your body. Broken leg, broken arm, maybe even lose your sight. Okay, so that was the situation with the 38-year-old man. Jesus indicated, I didn't write down the verse, 5:14, that Jesus told him to go and quit sinning because it might cause something worse next time. Not that God did it, but that because of your actions, you're doing high-risk things, you maybe ought to cut that out if you want to cut down on the possibility of injury. Okay, so if you recall, Job's friends, in their willingness to counsel Job, said the cause of his problem was punishment by God for the sin in his life. That's all they had ever known. And Job is the oldest book in the Bible, so this belief has been around in the life of the Hebrew people for a very long time. So which is it here in the case of this man born blind? Let's move on and see if we can see what we can determine. Let's look at verse 3 and 4. Listen as I read. Verse 3, neither this man, the question was, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? In verse 3, Jesus, in red letter, Jesus is speaking, and he says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. That was the first half of verse 4. So, turns out there's three choices. Was it the sin of man? Was it the sin of his parents? Or was it something else that was going to allow the works of God to be displayed? I think some call it his glory to be shown, that sort of thing. So in the NIV it says works for God's glory, is in other translations. Unlike the disciples looking for a human cause, Jesus looks for divine results. So God, did he inflict suffering on this man for his glory? Just did he inflict it so that he could have the opportunity to show his glory and his power? It doesn't say that God did it, that God caused it. It does not say that. It says it happened so that, quote, God's glory or his works could be shown. God can do what he pleases when he pleases because he is sovereign, but it does not say he caused it. God used this situation to show his glory or his works. Another way to think of this that's probably been used in Bible studies that you've been to before is talking about suffering. Does God cause suffering? The point is God uses suffering. He doesn't cause suffering necessarily. He uses suffering that you may find yourself in to build faith so that our faith can be built. That's the way when things are going well, it doesn't take a lot to trust in God. It's when we have the tough times in our life where our faith is built because we're forced to trust in God. And that was kind of a situation here, I believe. So it goes on in verse 4a, first part of verse 4, it says, as long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. But that's the work of God might be displayed in his life. We must do the work of him who sent me while it is still day, while Jesus is still among us. All right? The last part of verse 4, it says, for night is coming when no one can work. Night is coming. A time is coming when he will no longer be here, so that where no one can work is talking about miracles can no longer be performed at his hand, by his hand. He will not be here to personally do those miracles We need to be with Jesus, supporting Jesus while he is here, and getting the work done while it is still day is what he's talking about. Verse 5, let me read verse 5. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. While I am here, I am the light, so I can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. How true this is, but there is always a but. While he is in the world, he says he is the light of the world. But why does it stop right there with a period? If he is not here, look at Matthew 5, verse 14. He says, while I am in the world, I am the light of the world. You look at Matthew 5:14, and I'm thinking, well, what happens when Jesus is not here? He deals with that. Matthew 5:14 says this. Let me read. Just let me read 5:14. It says, you are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. You are the light of the world. While Jesus is here, he is the light of the world. But we are going to, who have trusted in Jesus, become the light of the world. There's expectation and responsibility that comes with following Christ, and we are to be the light of the world. This comes with an expectation and a responsibility, and that responsibility is living. How do you become the light of the world? That brings comes about by us living godly lives. Look at Ephesians 5, verses 8 through 11. For you were once in darkness. For you were once in darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Interesting. This is Paul talking to the Ephesians. Life as children of light, for the fruit of light consists of all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Okay? That is what comes with responsibility. If we are the light of the world, that's the kind of life we need to be living. And not only do we have those attributes, we need to find out what pleases the Lord. Okay, what we are not to do, we need to have nothing to do, starting going on with verse 11. It says, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness. So we've got the same words, key words in Ephesians that we had over in John, light and darkness. Live like light, stay away from darkness. Okay, so let's look at verse 6 and back to John 9. Let's look at verse 6 and 7. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. Jesus tells him to go to the pool of Siloam. He first spit and made a little mud and put it on his eyes. Then he tells him to go to the pool of Siloam, which means sent. We'll look at that in a minute. There's two very good points to be made here. One is the supply of water for this pool is from the Gihon Springs, which is what we talked about a couple of weeks ago. It's the same running water that is used in the water ceremony during the Feast of Tabernacles, where the priest would walk down the hill, fill a bucket up with water from the guy on spring, which was living water, walk up and pour the water on the altar. So he is being washed with living water. So this blind man gets an experience living. He gets to experience living water in a profound way through Jesus. The second thing I'd like to point out is that the name of the pool means sent. More than 20 times in John, Jesus is described as the one sent by God. Symbolically, the blind man is told to go wash in the place called sent by the one who was sent by God. So Jesus here is the source of healing, not the pool. The man is obedient and he is healed. No fanfare, just the facts. Important in this event is the fact that he was not healed until he showed obedience. Jesus put the mud on his eyes, and then he told him to go wash in the pool of Siloam with no further instruction. If he had never gone and washed the mud off of his eyes, what do you think would have happened? That's the instruction. Go wash. Jesus didn't go with him. He didn't check him out. Didn't tell anybody to watch him, follow him, see what he does. He said, just go do it. I think his obedience must show faith. He was not healed until he showed obedience, but he showed faith in being obedient. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in the book called The Cost of Discipleship, many of you may have heard of that. It's a book out of the 70s, I believe. Might even be older than that. It might have been the 60s. Very popular book, but it talks about, Dietrich Bonhoeffer talks about what comes first, faith or obedience. He says we must first be obedient and put ourselves in a position where faith is possible. Jesus told this man, go wash in the pool. Go wash in the pool of Siloam. So is that act of obedience and showing faith in doing that, is that what healed him? What if he had stayed home, looked around, hey, I don't see anybody looking. Let's go to the bathroom and think I'll wash this off my lavatory. Nobody's going to know. You think he would have been healed? Sometimes this faith and obedience go together. Which comes first? I don't really know. Okay? But he showed both faith and obedience in this situation. All right, let's look at verses 8 through 13. This is an interrogation that the Pharisees have of the neighbors. Let me read verses 8 through 13. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, is this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. I am the beggar you saw. Verse 10, it says, how then were your eyes opened, they asked. He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. In verse 12, where is this man, they asked. I don't know, he said. Then in verse 13, they brought the man to the Pharisees. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. So we have this interrogation going on between the neighbors and some friends, I guess, some neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging. They have this interrogation of the man. Then they're going to take him to the Pharisees for phase two of the interrogation. But they do not know how well His neighbors knew him, but they were not sure it was him, so everybody didn't know him very well. Some thought it just looks like him, but he says, yep, it was really me. He gives full credit to Jesus as the one who healed. He didn't say, well, I guess anybody could have done that if I'd known all these years. That's all I had to do. I'd have gone and done it. It wasn't that at all. He said Jesus did it. He says when asked, he could not tell them where he was at the present time. They did not reject the miracle, but they will look to the Pharisees for some counseling. It's like taking the fox down to the hen house. They're going to go to the Pharisees with some further interrogation to see if they can get to the bottom of this. So let's look at verse 14 to 17. Well, 13 says they brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. And 14, now the day on which I'm sorry about my voice today. I can't do a thing with it. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Uh-oh. I see trouble brewing right away. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Verse 16, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. In verse 17, then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, he is a prophet. Oh man, we got so many questions to deal with here. They questioned the blind man, but their concern is about the healing done on the Sabbath. That's always the question from the Pharisees. Well, it's on the Sabbath. Not much good can come of that. He's breaking the law. We've heard this part before. The man says, yes, I was healed. Right away, the Pharisees say Jesus is not from God because he violates the Sabbath. We're getting into the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit now, attributing good to evil and evil to good. Let me say right away, we talked about that last week, I think. Let me say right away that the fourth commandment was right and good the way it was intended. The day was to be devoted to the Lord, to God. The Pharisees made it something to be dreaded because of all of the rules that they put on it, that they came up with. The Pharisees even called Jesus a sinner, as if they were not. The man says he is a prophet. Doesn't say he's the Messiah. Now that's very interesting. Maybe we'll see what happens as we go on. So now we're going to phase 3 of the interrogation. We talk to the man. The neighbors and the people that knew him talked to him first. That's the first part 1. Then they go to the Pharisees for part 2 of the interrogation. Now we're going to go to part 3, which is an interrogation of his parents. Let me read verse 18 to 23. They still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. Is this your son, they asked? Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see? Verse 20, we know he is our son. Duh. The parents answered, and we know he was born blind. We were there when it happened, so we know. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself. Verse 22 says, his parents, now I've mentioned this before. I want you to hear what I'm saying. His parents said this because He said, his parents said, go ask him. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the temple, out of the synagogue. This was why the parents said, he is of age, go ask him. All right. This is really, really interesting. I know I keep saying this. This is the Word of God. It's all interesting, every word of it. The Pharisees questioned the man's parents. They want to know, is he your son? Was he born blind? How has he come to be able to see? Yes, and why? We know, we don't know. That's the answers. The final answer they gave out of fear of what the Pharisees could do to them, and that was kick them out of the synagogue, take away their temple privileges. If you recall, I pointed out to you that life of the Jews revolved around the temple. To lose their temple privileges would be a horrible thing to happen to them. But that's what they were afraid of. So they deflect the answer back to the Pharisees. Why don't you ask him? All right, let's look at verse 24 to 29. Now they're going to interview, going to phase 4. We're going to interview the man that was healed again, this second time around. Let me read 24 to 29. A second time, they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. He replied, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. Does that not give you goosebumps? That's a famous statement. Verse 26, then they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? Verse 27, he answered, I have told you already, and you do not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? That's sarcasm. We're going to come back and talk about it. Verse 28, then they hurled insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. Oh, man. The Pharisees called Jesus a sinner again for healing this man on the Sabbath. The man says that to judge Jesus as a sinner is not up to him, but he gives the famous statement, one thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. In my notes, I've got put in a parenthetical section. I want to read this to you. A little digression here. We cannot prove God. We cannot prove Jesus is the Son of God. We cannot disprove that we use Jesus as a crutch. Have you ever heard that? You just use Jesus as a crutch. You can't really disprove that. All of the things they say about us, all of these things the world says about us, all we can say is what the formerly blind man said. This one thing I know is what Jesus has done for me. It's personal experience. Pretty tough to argue with that. All right. This man's answer exasperated the Pharisees, and sometimes sarcasm will do that. Little sarcasm, little exasperation never hurt anybody. By now, their sarcasm, they're screaming, I'm sorry. By now, the Pharisees are screaming. What did he do? How did he do it? In verse 27, it's just a great verse. He totally blows them away with sarcasm. The man says, "Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to be his disciple?" Now they're screaming insults. All right, verse 29 is important because it leads up to verse 30. Let me read verse 29 again. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. Well, he's been told more than a handful of times. We don't even know where he comes from. Remember, that's one of the things last week we talked about when they were talking about Satan is your father. You know, one of the issues was I come from my father. My father sent me, and they don't want any part of that. And that figured into part of, you know, if you knew God is your father, you would know me, and that sort of thing. They said, we don't even know where he comes from. So let's look at verse 30 to 33. The man answered, "Now that is remarkable." Remarkable. You don't know where he comes from. This is the blind man talking, the man healed that was blind. This is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Verse 32, nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. Verse 33, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. My, oh my, remarkable. The final shot across the bow. You don't even know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. God doesn't listen to sinners. He only listens to godly men who do his will. Everything he's saying about Jesus, he's implying that those guys don't do. He healed me, blind from birth, so he must be from God. What do you have to say about that? All right, let's look at verse 34. To this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. That's it. How dare you? We are the leaders. We know. We're righteous. We are educated. We know everything. You are nobody. And they threw him out. We don't know if he was expelled from the temple. We don't, this thing we talked about before about why his parents said talk to him with afraid of losing their temple fellowship and temple rights. We don't know if that happened to him for good, or they just threw him out for today. Nevertheless, they threw him out. But he never really calls him Messiah. That's very interesting so far. He's acknowledged that he's from heaven. He's acknowledged he's a good man. He's even called him a prophet. He's said that he's not a sinner. He's doing God's will. All of those things. He said all of those things, but he never said he is the Messiah. The Jews can expel him from the synagogue, which is to exclude him from communion with God, to their way of thinking. The Catholics excommunicate from Catholicism, which is to exclude from communion with God and other things. I don't know a lot about that. This one thing I do know, nobody can exclude me from communion with God, or from service to him, or from worship of him. No matter what you say, no matter what my leaders say, no matter what your leaders say, no matter what he says, nobody can exclude me from communion with God, from service to God, and from worship of God. All right, let's look at verse 35 to 41. We're going to be talking about spiritual blindness. We need some perspective before we look at these verses. On the surface, to us, we should see nothing but joy for this man who was from birth from but now he can see. We should feel nothing but joy for him. He was healed on the Sabbath. Jesus has dealt with other things like that happened on the Sabbath, and he said you need to be looking at the situation, not the law. But he has lost nearly everything in the gaining of his sight. He got confused neighbors. He got his parents, and his parents were intimidated. He enraged religious leaders. He's got nowhere to go. He's not welcome at home. He's not welcome at work. He's not welcome at church. That is where this blind man is, for being healed and standing up for who healed him. All right, let's look at verse 35. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe me? Do you believe in the Son of Man?" I think Jesus says we need to put a cap on this project and bring it to a close. Do you believe in the Son of Man? But it says that he found him. So what do you think that means? I think it means Jesus went looking for him. He found him. And when he found him, he asked him something. Let me read it again. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Do you believe in the Son of Man? Not do you believe there is a Son of Man, or I believe you are the Son of Man. Do you believe in the Son of Man? The man, having lost everything, has to make a choice. Go back and recant all that sarcasm and accept what the Pharisees said about Jesus and return to the synagogue, or what? Believe in the Son of Man. It's the only two choices. What is there to believe in the Son of Man? That's a pretty simple sounding statement. Sure, I believe in the Son of Man. You heal me. Pretty simple. What does it mean? To say, yes, I believe in the Son of Man, it's more than saying I believe there is a Son of Man. I believe you are the Son of Man. I believe that you are the Messiah and all that goes with it. That God is his Father. It encompasses everything that's gone before that we've studied in John so far. If you say, I believe in the Son of Man, it says that he believes God is his Father. He believes that God sent him he was sent by God, that he is from heaven, and everything else that goes with it, which will be revealed at a later time, which is really like us. It's pretty simple to say, oh, yes, I believe in the Son of Man. And maybe that's all he knew. We know other things have been revealed about Jesus coming before this. So obviously, if you had heard those things, to say, I believe in the Son of Man would mean I believe those things too. But we don't know that he believed those things. But the same goes for us. At our initial conversion, you say, yes, Jesus died for my sin. I'm a sinner. And I've trusted in Jesus to do what he said he would do, and that is to provide salvation for me. But it also means other things. Maybe things that you didn't know about at the time you were saved. And that may be the same way he is. Things are revealed to us. We come to understand more as we go through our Christian walk. And that was kind of the way he is. When he's saying, I believe yes, and I believe in the Son of Man. Okay, I just want you to understand that because it's such a simple sounding question, but it's exactly like things are for a new Christian. They give themselves to God as they understand God, but they can't have a very deep understanding of God. They've only been saved for 10 seconds. They're the same now, 10 seconds after their conversion as they were 10 seconds before, except they have the love of Jesus Christ in their life. He's the same way. Let's look at verse 36 and 37. Who is he, sir? Who is the Son of Man? Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. No question. I believe there was a Son of Man. Yep, I'm him. Jesus said, I'm that guy. And I'm standing right here before you. So verse 38 says, the man said, Lord, Lord, there it is, Lord. Didn't say Jesus. He said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. How awesome. The confession of faith. He accepts him as Messiah. That's all he had to do, was accept him as Messiah. We'll come back. Something else I want to bring up. He accepts him as Messiah. It's an interesting point. He calls him Lord with a capital L. Charles Stanley pointed out that Jesus is called Lord 185 times in the four Gospels. I think I already pointed that out to you. He also says that there is not a requirement to take your life, to turn your life over to God, but it is heavily inferred. It's understood. And it's understood to the level of what I've already told you. He says, yes, I believe you are the Messiah. It also would infer that, yes, I believe you're the healer. You have much power to heal. But that may be all he knows. Okay? It is something that happens over time. It is, in terms of turning your life over to Jesus, it is something we do more and more as our faith grows. It may be the hardest thing for a non-believer to do. He comes from a world, the hardest thing for a non-believer to do may be saying, yes, I'll turn my life over to Jesus. Why is that? Because he comes from a world, a secular world that says, I do my own thing. I'm responsible for myself. I don't need anybody telling me what to do. Okay, that's the secular world talking, but that's what you have to get over. If you're going to trust Jesus, in our case, as the risen Christ, you've got to be able to do that. And if you trust him to do that, you will do that over time. All right, let's just keep going. Verse 39 says this. Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Wow. The weak will become strong, and the strong will become weak. It's been said before. Jesus is talking spiritual blindness here. The judgment has already been done. To reject Jesus as Messiah means the person will not go into darkness and therefore remain under condemnation. It means that he will remain in darkness. He doesn't go into darkness if he rejects Messiah. If he does not believe in him, it means he stays in the darkness. Look at John 3:18. I've read this to you many times, and I told you I would read it many more times. John 3:18. John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believes in him, shall not perish, but have eternal life. Okay? That's what you have to do. What happens if you don't do that? What if you don't believe? Verse 18 says, whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already, because they have not believed in the name of God's one and only Son. You start out in a condemned status. What you're trying to do is believe in Jesus, and you get out of that condemned status. But if you don't believe in him, nothing changes. You stay right there where you are. You stay right there in the darkness. That's where you like it. That's where you prefer it. And you see no reason to change. And he says they think they see, but they will find that they are blind to spiritual truth. I can see I'm the most righteous. I'm the educated. I'm the guy that knows. I'm the Pharisee. I'm the one that knows. I see. And what Jesus is saying, those that say they can see so clearly are actually spiritually blind. And the guy that was in darkness that wants to come out of the darkness, he's coming out of spiritual blindness into the light. And he's the one that becomes able to see. All right, let's look for the 40 and 41. Okay. Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, "What, are we blind too?" Pretty sharp. Verse 41, Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin, but now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." It remains. That's what I just read in John 3:18. If you don't change the way you believe, what you believe in, you're going to stay right where you are, and that's in a guilty status. Here's the most serious condition Jesus's opponents face: their insistence that they are innocent, as if Jesus will be convinced too by their word. Hardly. They keep pointing the finger at Jesus for being wrong, and their three fingers are pointing right back at them. You are wrong, Jesus. And 1, 2, 3, pointing right back at them. Verse 41, he's talking to the Pharisees. He said, we need to look at this again. It's more like those who think they see remain blind. I base this on the last part of verse 41. And I think I've already said this. I'm going to say it again. You claim to see, your guilt remains. If you do not come into the light, you remain under condemnation. I just read it in John 3:18 a minute ago. You walk in darkness, you like it in darkness, and you see no reason to change. Wow. All right. That's all I have for you today. Thanks for studying with me.